Hello and welcome back to Stones That Speak. Today I wanted to talk to you guys about something that I learned recently reading Philo of Alexandria. Now, if you don't know about Philo of Alexandria, he is a Jewish dude who lived in like the 1st century AD, and he was from Alexandria, as you might be able to tell from the name, and he was a Jewish Platonist of his era. So he's living in the Second Temple era. He's in Alexandria, so he's somewhat Hellenized. He's not a Jerusalem Jew. He's outside, but he's still super into the law. Specifically the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah, and he's also super into Plato. And what Philo does, being a guy who's super into Plato, is he wants to go look back at his traditional Jewish documents, right? These first 5 books of Moses especially, and point to them and say, hey, look, all of this stuff that we're learning from Plato is actually in this other stuff that's written down way before Plato. That my guys, they knew what was going on. Moses, listen, you know about Plato and Socrates, right? Like, those guys are cool. I'm all into them, don't get me wrong, but Moses had it way before those two. In fact, they probably stole it from Moses. So, I'm going to show you what's in the book of Genesis and them other books that Moses wrote that really shows that he was onto this Platonism thing way before Plato even came on the scene. And so he writes this commentary on the book of Genesis. And this commentary on the book of Genesis, among his other writings on the Bible, are kind of mind-blowing, to me anyway. The way that Philo uses Scripture and looks at Scripture in an allegorical fashion is just... It's tough to process as someone who's sort of grown up hearing maybe the broad strokes of the stories. I mean, don't get me wrong. As I've read all of these stories many times directly in the text, but thinking of them as stories, as these sort of just interesting narratives about interesting people that, were at the beginning of history, Philo's digging a lot deeper than that. And he's going almost word by word and picking out, just the barest shadows of meaning and turning them up to 11 and saying, look at this, look at this, look at this. This means something. And if you're not used to this style of Bible interpretation, it might hurt your brain a little bit. But once you get into it, Philo's got some stuff going on. And in particular, recently, diving back into his commentary on Genesis, which I peck in and out of, sort of as the whim takes me. I'm not sitting here powering through this as my main reading material, but I'll occasionally remember, I haven't read any Philo in a while, and I'll dip back in and have my mind blown, and then have to go off and chew on what he said for a month, and then I'll maybe go back and read another chapter. And that's basically what happened this last time. I was reading his commentary on the book of Genesis, and he talks... that's not the one I want. Here we go. He talks about of Cain and his birth, part 2. And I'll just read along here. And Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and brought forth Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man by means of the Lord. And he caused her also to bring forth Abel, his brother. These men, to whose virtue the Jewish religion bears testimony, he does not represent as knowing their wives, such as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and if there be any others of zeal like them. For since we say that woman is to be understood symbolically as the outward sense, and since knowledge consists in alienation from the outward sense and from the body, it is plain that the lovers of wisdom must repudiate the outward sense rather than choose it. And is this not quite natural? So to catch you up to speed, Philo's doing this allegorical reading of the book of Genesis, and he says, okay, we're talking about Adam and Eve, and they have these sons, right? But when these women show up in these texts, this, especially Eve to Philo, is this representation of the outward senses. And Philo wants you to understand that to be too connected to your outward senses is to actually be led farther away from the truth. That there is something that you need to have that's an upward knowledge, a noetic knowledge, to steal some terminology from some other people, that is a more pure and true knowledge that you cannot have if you're stuck with only the physical and the light of the eyes and the hearing of the ears. That there's a higher light and a higher music that is beyond all of that stuff. And so he reads allegorically that the women in these stories represent, and again, in particular, this woman, Eve, represents the wedding of man to something lower, but that he needs to be high. Now, it's, there's some sexism in there. Like, it's kind of tough to, as a 21st century person, to dig into these things and read this just sort of on the face of it, because Philo has zero chill on the, like, equal rights for women front. He's just, that hasn't even crossed his mind. But his reading here is still worth checking out. And this next part is really what I wanted to get into. He says, "For they who live with these men are in name indeed wives." So he's talking about the men who were not Adam, right? The previously named righteous men of the Old Testament. But in fact, virtues. Sarah is princess and guide. Rebecca is perseverance in what is good. Leah, again, is virtue, fainting and weary at the long continuation of exertion, which every foolish man declines and avoids and repudiates. Zipporah, the wife of Moses, is virtue, mounting up from earth to heaven and arriving at a just comprehension of the divine and blessed virtues which exist there, and she is called a bird. He's doing etymology there. Zipporah means bird. So he says these women are not that external sense, that there's something about them that represents a higher understanding. But that we may describe the conception and parturition of the virtues, let the superstitious either stop their ears or let them depart. And he goes on here for a little bit about, like, if you're, like, not in the group here, man, just put the book down and walk away, because you're going to hear some stuff that's tough to hear. But we must begin our explanations of these mysteries in this way. A husband unites with his wife, and the male human being with the female human being in union which tends to the generation of children, in strict accordance with the strict accordance and obedience to nature. But it is not lawful for virtues, which are the parents of many perfect things, to associate with a mortal husband. But they, without having received the power of generation from any other being, will never be able by themselves to conceive anything. So what is he saying here? He's saying that these virtues that these women represent, that they are going to be not able to produce the fruit that they're supposed to produce just by being united directly with men. You cannot reach up and grab the virtues and own them for yourselves. They are not something you can put in your bank account, in a box, in your house. You cannot hold them in your arms. They will not belong to you. Something has to generate something from them, but you as an earthly man cannot do this. Who then is it who sows good seed in them except the Father of the universe, the uncreated God, he who is the parent of all things? This, therefore, is the being who sows, and presently he bestows his own offspring, which he himself did sow. For God creates nothing for himself, inasmuch as he is in need of nothing, but he creates everything for him who is able to take it. All this stuff has to come from God. So these virtues that God has created, they are to produce fruit for men, but they're not going to produce it through the direct actions of men. God is going to unite with these virtues, which remain unsullied by the touch of man, and he's going to bring something forth. Now, he's going to explain this in his terms, is like allegory here in this next paragraph. about why he's saying this and how he's reading this in Scripture. And I will bring forward as a competent wisdom and proof of what I have said the most holy Moses. For he introduces, no, so he's talking about Moses writing now. He's conceptualizing the Torah as all being directly written by Moses. He introduces Sarah as conceiving a son when God beheld her by himself. But he represents her as bringing forth her son not to him who beheld her then, but to him who is eager to attain wisdom, and his name is called Abraham. And he teaches the same lesson more plainly in the case of Leah, where he says that God opened her womb. But to open the womb is the especial business of the husband, and she, having conceived, brought forth not to God, for he alone is sufficient and all abundant for himself, but to him who underwent labor for the sake of that which is good, namely for Jacob. So that, in this instance, virtue received the divine seed from the great cause of all things, but brought forth her offspring to one of her lovers, who deserved to be preferred to all her other suitors. Again, when the all-wise Isaac addressed his supplication to God, Rebekah, who was perseverance, became pregnant by the agency of him who received the supplication. But Moses, who received Zipporah, that is to say, winged and sublime virtue, without any supplication or entreaty on his part, found that she conceived by no mortal man. Okay. Philo, looking at his Old Testament, right? Looking at the law, the Torah, the book of Genesis in particular, and also Exodus in the case of that last entry there, is reading about the conception of these children. And he sees that Adam knows his wife and brings forth Cain. Now, Philo doesn't explicitly mention this, but I'm going to point out, if you read just a few letters later in that verse, what happens after that? She brings forth again and has Abel. Adam does not know his wife a second time in the text. Does not mention that there is any union between Adam and Eve to bring forth Abel. She just brings forth Abel. Similarly, in the story of Abraham, Abraham's promised a seed. He doesn't understand where that seed's coming from. Sarah says, hey, why don't you take Hagar? She's my handmaid. Says he goes into Hagar. She conceives Ishmael. He's trying to take hold of this promise of God through his own work, right? To make it happen in his own way. And he tries to generate it. And the scriptures specifically say, in that instance, that Abraham went into Hagar and produced Ishmael. When Sarah conceives and brings forth Isaac, doesn't mention Abraham going into her. Likewise, in most of the cases, when Leah and Israel, when they are conceiving seed, it says it does not mention that he entered in unto her, except in one case where she had the mandrakes and she traded them for his affection, let's say. So we need to think about what is happening in this narrative. And he's talking about Cain. And a little bit later, I think, he's going to talk about Cain's name. What does Cain mean? Cain means possession. Cain means a spear, right? The spear that goes into something and makes it your possession. And he's saying that this spirit of ownership, of making things into things, reifying the world, this is the spirit of Cain. It's ultimately the spirit that kills the other spirit of Abel. But that spirit is the spirit that men bring forth when they take hold of the virtues. Right? And that's why it's significant that the mandrake incident, it mentions Jacob goes into Leah, because what is happening in that instance? In the other instances, God is giving things to Leah. He's handing her the blessing of having children because he sees that she's been rejected, right? He opens her womb. In the case of the mandrakes, what does she do? She takes the responsibility for having children upon herself. She tries to generate with Jacob a transaction, right? I will give you this if you give me your time in bed tonight. And then the scriptures specifically say that there is now this uniting between the man and the woman, which produces, I forget who that produces, Issachar maybe? And the end of this last paragraph is so mind-blowing because, again, this isn't the way anybody else reads the Bible that I know of, okay? For Philo to go out on this limb here and say, and I'm going to read this again in case you've forgotten because it's been a minute I've been talking. Moses, who received Zipporah, that is to say, part winged and sublime virtue, without any supplication or entreaty on his part, found that she conceived by no mortal man. Philo's got a virgin birth in the Old Testament. Why? Why does he have a virgin birth in the Old Testament? Because it doesn't say that Moses and Zipporah got together in the passage. Now, from a historical view of Moses, you might look back and say, well, I'm pretty sure Moses and Zipporah were together at some point. But if you want to be sola scriptura like Philo of Alexandria is, you must bow down before the scriptures and understand that they do not speak explicitly of this, and therefore you cannot know that it happened. Why did they leave it out? Philo thinks he knows. He thinks there's something pretty important about this lack of involvement of a man in the generation of a new seed. Let's continue reading. I'm going to skip this part because well, no, I'm not. Now I bid ye, initiated men, who are purified as to your ears, to receive these things as mysteries which are really sacred in your inmost souls, and reveal them not to anyone who is of the number of the uninitiated. Sorry, Philo, I'm blowing it up in here. But guard them as a sacred treasure, laying up them in your own hearts, not in a storehouse in which are gold and silver, perishable substances, but in that treasure house in which the most excellent of all the possessions of the world does lie, the knowledge, namely, of the first cause and of virtue, and in the third place of the generation of them both. And if you ever meet with anyone who has been properly initiated, cling to that man affectionately and adhere to him, that if he has learned any more recent mystery, that he may not conceal it from you before you have learnt to comprehend it thoroughly. For I myself, having been initiated in the great mysteries by Moses, the friend of God, nevertheless, when subsequently I beheld Jeremiah the prophet, and learnt that he was not only initiated into the sacred mysteries, Jeremiah's a Platonist too, in other words, but also a complete hierophant or expounder of them, did not hesitate to become his pupil. And he, like a man very much under the influence of inspiration, uttered an oracle in the character of God, speaking in this manner to the most peaceful virtue, hast thou not called me as thy house, and thy father, and the husband of thy virginity? Showing by this expression most manifestly that God is both the house, the incorporeal abode of incorporeal ideas, and the father of all things, inasmuch as it is he who created them, and the husband of wisdom, sowing for the race of mankind the seed of happiness in good and virgin soil. Now, just a little note there, that verse that you saw him quoting is not the way it is rendered in most translations of the Bible, because Philo is very, very big on the Septuagint. Philo don't read very good Hebrew, kind of a little bit, but he's not like a native speaker and reader, so he kind of picks his way through. But he has a ton of respect for the Septuagint translation of the Bible into Greek, and the thing he just quoted from Jeremiah is from the Greek. It's the way it renders it. You can kind of read it in English. If you look up a Septuagint translation of Jeremiah 4:9, I think. I'm actually not sure. But you can Google search that string of text and it'll come up. It's a little different than the Masoretic text. For it is fitting for God to converse with an unpolluted and untouched and pure nature, in truth and reality virgin, in a different manner from that in which we converse with such. For association with men, with a view to the procreation of children, makes virgins women. But when God begins to associate with the soul, he makes that which was previously woman now again virgin. Since banishing and destroying all the degenerate appetites unbecoming a human being, by which it had been made effeminate, he introduces in their stead genuine and perfect and unadulterated virtues. Therefore he will not converse with Sarah, before all habits, such as other women have left her, Genesis 18:11, till she has returned into the class of pure virgins. But it is perhaps possible that in some cases a virgin soul may be polluted by intemperate passions, and so become impure. On which account the sacred oracle has been cautious, calling God the husband not of a virgin, for a virgin is subject to change and to mortality, but of virginity, of an idea, that is to say, which is always existing in the same principles, and in the same manner. For as all things endowed with distinctive qualities are by nature liable to origination and to destruction, so those archetypal powers, which are the makers of those particular things, have received an imperishable inheritance in their turn. Therefore, is it seemly that the uncreated and unchangeable God should ever sow the ideas of immortal and virgin virtues in a woman who is transformed into the appearance of virginity? Why then, O soul, since it is right for you to dwell as a virgin in the house of God, and to cleave to wisdom, do you stand aloof from these things and rather embrace the outward sense which makes you effeminate and pollutes you? Therefore you shall bring forth an offspring altogether polluted and altogether destructive, the fratricidal and accursed Cain, a possession not to be sought after, for the name Cain being interpreted means possession. Maybe you're already ahead of me with where I'm going with this. It doesn't take too much to stack up the blocks that Philo stacked up here with the knowledge that we have now as Christians 2,000 years after the birth of Jesus, and think to yourself, how did this guy know? How in the world does this dude come up with this idea that God generates his good seed in the world through virginity itself, through untaintable virginity, without ever having read anything from the book of Matthew? Now, he has read Isaiah, okay? So we can give him that. He knows about Isaiah. He probably knows a virgin shall conceive and bring forth a son and call his name Emmanuel. But he's not thinking of it as a prophecy here. He doesn't know about Jesus. He's a contemporary of Jesus, but he doesn't, he hasn't heard, right? He's off somewhere else, same time, different place. He's not, conceivable he hears about some guy doing miracles, right? But all of this stuff is not from sort of, I was told it and so I believe it. Philo is generating the necessity of the virginity of Mary as the instrument which God uses to bring his good seed into the world from the Old Testament itself. Not just from Isaiah, again, not just from it says it in Isaiah. He's going from a principled reading, an allegorical principal reading of the book of Genesis, and saying, ostensibly saying all the way back to Eve, we should have understood man wasn't going to be involved with bringing forth the seed that God would choose. Abel comes forth not of the work of man within the text, okay? Not making any arguments about the historical Abel. I'm just saying how it's wrote down. Abel comes forth from the woman without the use of the man. The one who comes forth of the woman through the use of the man slays him. Let's read a little more about Cain here. One may wonder at the kind of narration which the Jewish lawgiver frequently employs in many instances where he departs from the usual style. For after giving the history of those parents of the human race who were created out of the earth, he begins to relate the story of the firstborn of human parents, concerning whom he says absolutely nothing, as if he had already frequently mentioned his name and were not now bringing it forward for the first time. Accordingly, he simply says that she brought forth Cain. What sort of being was he, O writer? And what have you ever said about him before, either of great or small importance? And yet you are not ignorant of the importance of a proper application of names. For before this time, as you proceed in your history, you show this. When speaking in reference to the same person, you say Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and brought forth a son, and she called his name Seth. Therefore it was much more necessary in the case of the firstborn, who was the beginning of the generation of men, from one display, to display the nature of him who was thus conceived and born, in the first place showing that he was a male child, and secondly mentioning his peculiar name Cain. Since therefore it was not owing to inexperience or to ignorance, so he's saying like, the writer didn't forget to mention that Eve named him that. We can look like 10 verses later and say that she talks about Eve names Seth. So that's not what's going on here. Since it was not owing to inexperience or ignorance of according to what persons he ought to give names, that he appears to have discarded his usual practice in the case of Cain. We must now consider on what account he thus named those who were born of our first parents, rather than mentioning the name in an incidental way than actually giving it. And the cause, it appears to me, according to the best conjecture that I can form, is this. All the rest of the human race gives names to things which are different from themselves, so that the thing which we see is one thing, but the name which we see is another. But in the history of Moses, the names which he affixes to things are the most conspicuous energies of the things themselves. So in this allegorical reading, the things are the things. Think about, it might be difficult from the Bible because we don't read things like that, but John Bunyan does this in Pilgrim's Progress all the time. Christian is a Christian. The giant despair is despair. You get what I'm saying? And you may learn this more clearly from the previous example which I have mentioned. When the mind which is in us, and let it be called Adam, meeting with the outward sense according to that to which all living creatures appear to exist, and that is called Eve, having conceived a desire for connection is associated with this outward sense that one conceives as in a net, and hunts after the external object of our outward sense naturally. For by means of the eyes it arrives at a conception of color, by the ears it conceives of sound, by nostrils it arrives at a conception of smells, by flavors flavors by the organs of taste, and of all substance, by whose touch, and having thus conceived it, becomes pregnant. And immediately it is in labor and brings forth the greatest of all evils of the soul, namely vain opinion. For it conceives an opinion that everything that it has seen, that it has heard, that it has tasted, that it has smelled, or that it has touched belongs to itself, and looks upon itself as the inventor and creator of them all. So Philo is saying, look, this pattern that we see with Cain, where he starts as a possessor, right? It's not just the name that the dude was given. It is literally what was brought forth from Adam knowing his wife. These outward senses, right? This curse that we have, that we're constantly fighting of thinking this belongs to me, of anything that is in our lives, that it belongs to us. All right, I've got a coffee cup right here. I would speak of this coffee cup as if it belonged to me. But do you know what God can do? Very easily, he can take it away. I have a wife, I have children. In some sense, I think I would probably think of myself as being attached to those things, of being possessing those things. But I cannot stop God from taking them back. All of these things are transitory. And the spirit of Cain is to think, I can own it, I can keep it, I can hold on just a little longer, I can have a few more years of life, I can have a little bit more money, I can have a little bit more food, I can take hold. And Abel doesn't have this. Abel is off keeping the sheep. Keeping the sheep I want you to remember, not a useful for the body thing at the time that he's doing it. Okay? They're not eating meat. Right? We don't get to the Noahic covenant until Noah, where they're allowed to eat meat. When Cain is raising his vegetables, he's raising things that he can take and he can eat and he can nourish himself with. When Abel is raising sheep, the only thing that he can do with those sheep is to take of what they give him, right? So he might be shearing them for wool, and sacrificing them to God. Abel is, in a sense, the seventh day. The leftover, the extra, the fringe, the corner of the field, the corner of the beard that's left untrimmed. He's the guy who doesn't really seem to be doing that much useful. The sheep are giving him just what they have left over on the outside of their bodies, and that's it. That's all he can maybe glean from them. We don't even know if he's shearing these sheep, right? I'm saying possibly that's an echo of that pattern. But the only thing we know for sure is that he's sacrificing them to God. His entire existence is extra. He can't take hold on them. He can't put them in his body and make them part of himself. He can only offer them up at this time. Cain has the ability to raise up things to eat, right? He is the tiller of the ground, and yet that ownership and that pride that he brings into the world makes him jealous of Abel and his offering that was accepted. Now, Philo goes on to continue this thought, and I highly recommend reading this book, but I wanted to circle back around to this idea of the necessity of virginity in the figurative sense, at least. Right? This is why the doctrines of Mary that seem weird to me as a Protestant who didn't read any Philo until last week, right? Not this part of Philo anyway. You think well, where are you getting all this stuff, you weirdo 4th century Catholics talking about this perpetual virginity? And again, I am not prepared to make any historical arguments from what Philo says about the perpetual virginity thing, but you can see why they're positing this. Mary as this holy principle, as this heavenly virtue, as the Sophia of Proverbs, right? That calls to men and brings them into her house. This perfect heavenly principle cannot be marred by any man, cannot be possessed by any man. We can only receive the good gifts that God produces through her. That's what Philo's trying to tell us. He didn't know anything about Christianity, and yet he knew more about Christianity than I did. And that's the thought that I wanted to share with you. There's some fascinating wisdom to be found in these old texts, and the way that these people who have been studying the Bible, who are wiser, well, at least somewhat, sometimes, I don't think you should necessarily take everything Philo says as perfectly, completely true, but to process the way he's thinking about Scripture and to really let that sort of lubricate the gears of your understanding, it's a mind flip. It really does change the entire way you look at Scripture. Not in a bad way, in my opinion. And I don't think it does anything, it doesn't do any damage to a historical reading of Scripture, but it does give you access to so much more meaning and understanding. So I recommend you check out this book if you haven't already. It's $3 on Kindle. The complete works of Philo of Alexandria, easy to pick up if you're into digital reading at all. I'm sure you can get through it faster than I have, because I'm a slowpoke with this stuff. But I just wanted to share a little bit of something that I had enjoyed learning about. That's all I have for today. Appreciate your time and attention. We'll see you next time.